The most dangerous men in the galaxy are usually the quiet ones. The war hall of the Karath flagship smelled like hot metal, ozone, and burned engine fuel. Crimson banners hung from the ceiling nearly 40 feet above the polished black floor, while thousands of alien soldiers filled the chamber in complete silence. At the center of it all stood Warlord Valera. Her deep blue skin shimmered beneath the pale white war lights woven into her silver armor like frozen fire. She looked less like a ruler and more like the living embodiment of conquest itself. Every officer bowed when she moved. Every servant lowered their eyes. Every soldier feared the sound of her footsteps. All except one. Ethan Graves stood directly behind her throne with his hands folded behind his back and a black military collar wrapped around his throat. 6'4", broad shoulders, short dark blonde hair, gray eyes that never seemed to blink enough. Human. The room hated him for existing. Valera hated him most of all. Step forward, human, she commanded without turning around. Ethan obeyed immediately. His heavy boots echoed once across the floor before the chamber went still again. Valera slowly rose from her throne and circled him like a predator examining prey. Her golden eyes moved across the scars on his jaw, the old burns on his hands, the emotionless calm on his face. The galaxy calls humans Deathworld vermin, she said coldly. Yet your kind continues to survive every war thrown at you. Ethan said nothing. That annoyed her more than defiance ever could. Valera suddenly stopped inches from him. Look at me when I speak. Ethan lifted his eyes. Calm. Steady. Empty like winter skies before a storm. The tension inside the hall tightened instantly. Several officers shifted uncomfortably. One older commander near the throne quietly looked away first. Valera noticed. Her lips curled with irritation. Then she spat directly into Ethan's face. The sound was small, but in the silence of the chamber, it felt like an explosion. A few soldiers laughed nervously. Others waited for the human to react. Ethan didn't. He simply wiped his cheek with one gloved hand before returning it behind his back. No anger. No humiliation. No fear. Just silence. Somehow that silence frightened the room more than rage would have. Valera narrowed her eyes. Do you feel nothing, human? Ethan answered in a low voice roughened by years of smoke and cold air. I feel the temperature dropping. Confused murmurs spread across the chamber. Then the lights flickered once. The giant warship groaned beneath everyone's feet as distant thunder rolled through the metal walls. One of the officers hurried toward the throne. Warlord, we are approaching the ice border near Sector 12. Sensors detected rebel activity. Valera never looked away from Ethan. Then perhaps our human guard will finally prove useful. Ethan remained perfectly still, but several veteran soldiers near the back of the hall exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen men like him before. Not soldiers, survivors. And survivors from Deathworlds were rarely the same as everyone else. As Valera returned to her throne, her gaze briefly drifted toward the black collar around Ethan's neck. For the first time, she noticed something carved beneath the metal restraint. Tiny letters almost hidden under years of scratches. Property of the Deathworld arena. Her expression changed for less than a second. But Ethan noticed. The Karath flagship drifted through the frozen edge of Sector 12 like a blade sliding through black water. Outside the massive viewing ports, endless fields of ice asteroids rotated silently beneath pale blue starlight. Inside the command deck, tension moved through the air thicker than smoke. Officers whispered behind lowered hands. Crew members avoided standing too close to the human guard near the throne. Rumors traveled fast aboard military ships, especially old rumors. Valera sat with one armored leg crossed over the other as tactical projections flickered across her face. Her expression remained calm, but her thoughts kept returning to the tiny words hidden beneath Ethan's collar. Property of the Deathworld arena. She knew the arena. Every ruler in the galaxy knew it. A place where violent worlds sent their strongest survivors to entertain empires hungry for blood and spectacle. Very few competitors lived longer than a year there. Champions almost never survived retirement. Yet Ethan Graves stood only 20 feet behind her now, perfectly still beside the war chamber doors. Alive, quiet, breathing slow. That unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Bring me the navigation reports, she ordered sharply. A young servant hurried toward the throne carrying a glowing data slate with trembling hands. The boy could not have been older than 16 Earth years. Thin shoulders, nervous eyes, one wrong movement away from disaster. As he approached the raised platform, the ship suddenly shuddered from turbulence near the ice field. The servant stumbled. The data slate slipped from his hands and clattered across the polished floor directly at Veilira's feet. Silence crushed the room instantly. The boy froze in horror. Every officer on the deck lowered their eyes. Karath law was ruthless about public mistakes aboard military vessels. Veilira slowly stood from her throne. "Look at me," she said coldly. The servant's breathing became shaky. "Please forgive me, Warlord." Her silver cape dragged softly across the floor as she descended the platform one step at a time. Ethan watched from the shadows near the door without moving. Veilira stopped directly in front of the terrified boy. "Do you know what happens to servants who fail publicly during wartime?" she asked. The boy's eyes filled with panic. "Yes, Warlord." "Then explain it." "Failure weakens discipline." His voice cracked. "And weakness spreads." Veilira leaned closer. "Good. At least your education was not wasted." The entire deck remained frozen. No one dared interfere. Ethan's gray eyes shifted slightly toward the servant, then toward Veilira. The boy looked ready to collapse. Something inside the room changed almost invisibly. A small tension, a pressure beneath the silence. Veilira sensed it immediately. She turned her head slowly toward Ethan. He still had not moved. But for the first time since stepping aboard her flagship, his eyes no longer looked empty. They looked focused, dangerous in a way that did not require anger. Veilira narrowed her gaze. "You disagree with my methods, human?" Ethan answered calmly. "Fear keeps people obedient." He paused briefly. "Not loyal." Several officers inhaled sharply. Speaking to a Karath warlord like that bordered on insanity. Veilira studied him carefully. And what would a Deathworld survivor know about loyalty? Ethan looked at the frightened servant before answering. Enough not to destroy it in front of everyone. The war chamber fell completely silent again. Even the engines seemed quieter somehow. Veilira held his stare for several long seconds. Then, unexpectedly, she stepped aside from the servant. "Clean the floor and return to your station," she said without emotion. The boy nearly collapsed with relief before scrambling away. Confusion spread across the officers. No punishment. No humiliation. Nothing. Veilira slowly returned to her throne, though her thoughts no longer focused on the frozen war zone outside the ship. They focused on the impossible human standing behind her chair. Because for one brief second, Ethan Graves had challenged her authority without raising his voice. And somehow, she had listened. The storm alarms began at 0213 ship time. Deep metallic pulses rolled through the Karath flagship as the vessel entered the outer edge of the frozen debris field surrounding Sector 12. Ice fragments the size of transport trucks drifted past the viewing ports, while blue lightning flashed silently across the darkness beyond the hull. The bridge lights dimmed to emergency levels, covering the war chamber in cold silver shadows. Veilira stood near the tactical display with her hands clasped behind her back, studying the rotating battle projections hovering in front of her face. Rebel ships had disappeared from long-range scanners 3 hours earlier. That alone bothered her. Cowards usually ran. Smart enemies vanished. Thermal readings remain unstable. One officer reported nervously. "We are detecting signal interference from beneath the ice field." Veilira's eyes narrowed. "Natural. Unknown, Warlord." The room fell quiet again except for the low hum of engines fighting against gravitational turbulence. Ethan remained near the rear exit of the chamber exactly where he had stood for the last 6 hours. Motionless. Watching everything. Veilira still could not decide what unsettled her more about him. His silence. Or the fact that experienced soldiers kept unconsciously moving farther away from him whenever possible. Suddenly, the chamber doors slid open with a hydraulic hiss. A tall alien male entered wearing dark ceremonial armor trimmed with gold. Prince Kaler, son of one of the Empire's ruling bloodlines and a man who carried arrogance like perfume. He smiled the moment he saw Ethan standing behind the throne. "So the rumors are true," Kaler said loudly. "Our glorious warlord travels with a human guard dog now." Several officers immediately lowered their eyes. Veilira looked unimpressed. "State your business." Kaler ignored the question entirely as he walked toward Ethan instead. I have heard stories about your kind, he continued. Deathworld creatures. Violent. Unpredictable. Barely civilized. Ethan did not respond. Kaler smirked. And yet here you stand wearing a collar. He circled Ethan slowly. Tell me, human, does obedience come naturally to your species, or did they break you first? Still nothing. The prince's smile faded slightly. Men like Kaler enjoyed reactions. Fear, anger, humiliation. Ethan gave him none of it. The storm outside intensified. Ice particles scraped against the hull with sounds like distant claws across metal. Kaler suddenly reached toward the black collar around Ethan's throat. Perhaps I should see what kind of animal hides underneath this thing. The entire chamber tensed instantly. Veilira noticed it immediately. 3 veteran officers near the navigation deck subtly stepped backward at the same time. One technician quietly shut off his console microphone. Even the servant boy from earlier froze in place near the wall. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward the prince's hand resting against the collar. Calm. Empty. Cold enough to stop breathing. Kaler hesitated for the first time. Veilira saw it happen. A tiny shift in confidence. The human had not moved a single inch. But somehow the entire atmosphere of the room changed around him. Then the ship violently lurched sideways as a shockwave rolled. Through the hull, warning sirens exploded across the bridge. Red emergency lights flooded the chamber. Incoming vessels, an officer shouted. Multiple signatures emerging from beneath the ice field. Tactical projections burst alive above the command deck. Unknown warships rose from the frozen debris like ghosts beneath dark water. Dozens of them. Hidden. Waiting. Veilira immediately stepped toward the command platform. Battle stations now. Her voice cut through the chaos like sharpened steel. Crew members rushed across the chamber while alarms screamed overhead. But Ethan never looked away from Prince Kaler. Not until the prince slowly removed his hand from the collar. Only then did Ethan finally speak. Quietly. That was the smart choice. For the first time since boarding the flagship, Prince Kaler looked genuinely afraid. The first enemy ship appeared like a shadow rising through frozen water. Then another followed behind it. Then 20 more. Massive black war cruisers emerged silently from beneath the drifting ice field surrounding Sector 12 until the stars themselves disappeared behind steel hulls and cold engine lights. The Karath flagship trembled as targeting systems screamed across the command deck. Officers rushed between stations while red warning lights flashed over terrified faces. Veilira stood at the center of the chaos with absolute control carved into every movement. Raise defensive screens, she ordered sharply. Divert reactor power to forward cannons. Holographic projections exploded across the bridge, showing enemy formations tightening around them like hunters surrounding wounded prey. Ethan remained near the rear platform beside the throne, silent as ever, though his gray eyes tracked every movement across the tactical displays. Veilira noticed that immediately. He was not watching the panic. He was studying patterns, angles, escape routes, survival. These ships were waiting for us, one officer said nervously. This is an ambush. Obviously. Prince Kaler snapped while adjusting his ceremonial armor with shaking hands. He clearly hoped nobody noticed. Destroy them before they close distance. The tactical commander swallowed hard. Their signal signatures do not match rebel fleets. Veilira turned slowly. Then whose ships are they? Before anyone answered, the main screen flickered once. A transmission forced itself through the flagship's communication barriers. Static hissed through the chamber speakers before a distorted figure appeared above the command platform. Tall, hooded, mechanical voice. Warlord Veilira. The figure said calmly. You carry something that does not belong to the Karath Empire. Several officers exchanged confused glances. Veilira's expression hardened. Identify yourself. Return the human champion. Silence crashed across the bridge harder than the alarms themselves. Ethan did not move. But Veilira saw several soldiers instinctively look toward him at once. The hooded figure continued. The arena does not lose property. Veilira slowly turned her head toward Ethan. You belong to them? Ethan answered without emotion. Not anymore. That is incorrect, the figure interrupted coldly. Subject Graves remains registered under arena ownership. Subject, not soldier, not man. Veilira suddenly understood something she had not considered before. The collar around Ethan's neck was not ceremonial. It was a tracking device. A leash. You sent an entire fleet for one human? She asked. The figure's distorted face tilted slightly. Not for a human. A brief pause followed. For what he becomes when cornered. The transmission ended instantly. Silence followed. Heavy. Uneasy. Even the officers looked disturbed now. Prince Kaler forced out a nervous laugh. This is absurd. He is one man. Ethan finally looked at him directly. You should keep believing that. Kaler said nothing after that. Veilira stepped down from the command platform and approached Ethan slowly while the battle alarms continued flashing around them. Up close, she noticed something strange. He looked calm. Not fearless. Not confident. Prepared. Like a man standing inside familiar weather. Why are they afraid of you? She asked quietly. Ethan stared at the frozen battlefield outside the massive viewing glass. Blue engine fire reflected softly across his face. Because the arena only kept one rule. Which was? His jaw tightened slightly. If the crowd stopped cheering, he paused. They released something bigger. Veilira held his gaze for several seconds. Then the ship shook violently again as distant impacts rolled through the hull. Enemy ships had entered firing range. Officers shouted across the bridge. The flagship's defensive barriers flickered dangerously. Outside the viewing ports, black war cruisers surrounded them from every direction like wolves closing around firelight in a blizzard. Veilira turned sharply toward her crew. Prepare combat formations immediately. Then, after the briefest hesitation, she looked back at Ethan. Stay close to me. Ethan's expression never changed. But for the first time since boarding her flagship, he answered without sounding like a prisoner. That would be the smart choice. The battle began without sound. Outside the massive viewing ports, blue flashes erupted across the frozen darkness as Karath cannons fired through drifting ice fields. Enemy warships answered immediately. Light tore silently through space while the flagship groaned beneath the pressure of repeated impacts. Inside the command deck, the calm discipline of the Empire was beginning to crack. Officers barked overlapping reports. Warning symbols flooded every tactical display. One of the navigation stations exploded in a shower of sparks, forcing nearby crew members backward. The smell of burned circuitry spread quickly through the chamber. Veilira remained standing at the center platform, though the tension in her shoulders had sharpened. Report damage, she demanded. Forward shields down to 42%, the tactical commander answered. Port engine stabilizers failing. Another violent tremor rolled through the flagship. Frost suddenly spread across sections of the viewing glass as temperatures dropped near the outer hull. The frozen battlefield outside looked endless now. Black enemy ships moved slowly through drifting ice like predators beneath dark water. Veilira's eyes narrowed. They are hurting us. Ethan stood beside the throne platform, watching the enemy formations with unsettling focus. Yes, he said, quietly, toward the dead zone. Several officers looked confused. Ethan pointed toward the tactical projection hovering above the bridge. That section of the ice field. His voice remained calm. No debris movement. No reflected engine heat. Empty space in the middle of a war zone usually means one thing. Veilira followed his gaze immediately. An ambush inside the ambush. Hidden weapons platforms, she realized. Ethan gave a slight nod. Before she could respond, Prince Kaler stepped forward with obvious irritation. Why are we listening to him? He snapped. He is arena property. Ethan ignored him completely. That somehow angered the prince even more. You think silence makes you dangerous? Kaler continued loudly. You are still wearing a collar like a trained animal. Ethan finally looked at him. Calm. Cold. And you are still talking during combat. The bridge went quiet again. Veilira almost smiled. Almost. Suddenly the flagship shook harder than before. Emergency sirens screamed overhead as the entire vessel tilted violently to one side. Crew members grabbed consoles to avoid falling. Direct hit to the lower reactor wing, someone shouted. We lost 2 defense batteries. The lights flickered. For half a second, darkness swallowed the bridge entirely. Then emergency power returned in deep red pulses. In that brief darkness, Veilira heard something strange behind her. Metal snapping softly. When the lights returned, Ethan was no longer standing beside the throne. He had moved silently across the chamber toward the servant stations near the far wall. A support beam damaged during the impact had partially collapsed above the frightened crew members there. Ethan held the bent steel beam in place with both hands while several terrified servants scrambled out from beneath it. The entire bridge stared, not because he helped them, but because of the way he held the twisted metal structure steady, as if the weight barely mattered. Veins tightened across his forearms beneath the dim red lighting. His breathing never changed. Veilira noticed something else too. The servant boy from earlier looked up at Ethan with absolute disbelief. Not fear. Trust. Ethan waited until the last crew member escaped before lowering the damaged beam carefully onto the floor. No dramatic effort. No display. Just quiet control. He wiped grease from one hand onto his black sleeve and returned toward the command platform like nothing unusual had happened. Prince Kaler looked disturbed now. What exactly are humans made of? He muttered under his breath. Ethan stopped beside the throne once more. Bad weather, he answered. Veilira stared at him for several long seconds while red emergency lights flickered across his scarred face. Then another transmission warning appeared on the tactical screen. The hidden enemy fleet was moving into position beneath the ice field. Waiting, closing, hunting. And for the first time since entering Sector 12, Veilira realized something deeply unsettling. The enemy fleet was not the most dangerous thing aboard her ship. The Karath flagship plunged deeper into the frozen dead zone with enemy warships closing from every direction. Outside the cracked viewing ports, drifting ice fields reflected cannon fire in pale blue flashes that looked almost beautiful from a distance. But inside the command deck, the atmosphere had changed completely. The officers were no longer afraid of losing the battle. They were afraid of not understanding what they had brought aboard their ship. Ethan stood beside the throne platform with one hand resting loosely behind his back, while emergency lights pulsed red across his black uniform. The damaged collar around his neck reflected the flashing lights like fractured steel. Veilira could not stop looking at it now. Property of the Deathworld arena. Those words had infected the bridge like poison. Every veteran soldier there understood what the arena represented. Survival beyond reason. Enemy vessels repositioning. The tactical commander warned. They are funneling us toward the central ice shelf. Veilira narrowed her eyes at the projection. The enemy fleet was moving with precision now. Controlled. Deliberate. They want us trapped before boarding, she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. Yes. How do you know? Because that is what the arena used to do. His answer chilled the room more than the failing ship temperature ever could. Prince Kaler folded his arms tightly. Enough with these cryptic answers. His voice sounded weaker now. You speak like you know these hunters personally. Ethan looked toward the frozen battlefield outside the viewing glass. I do. Silence followed. Then another heavy impact rolled through the flagship. Several overhead lights burst in showers of sparks. Crew members stumbled against consoles, while warning sirens screamed through the chamber again. Veilira grabbed the edge of the command platform to steady herself. Ethan never moved at all. He adjusted naturally with the motion of the ship, like someone whose body already expected chaos before it arrived. That unsettled her deeply. Explain yourself, Veilira ordered. Ethan remained silent for a moment. Then he finally spoke without looking at anyone. Earth is classified as a death world because everything there fights to survive. His voice stayed calm. Matter of fact. Storms. Oceans. Diseases. Predators. Gravity. He paused briefly. Humans adapt because we do not get a choice. The bridge listened in complete silence now. Even Kaler stopped interrupting. The arena learned something valuable about humans. Ethan continued quietly. Fear stops working after enough pain. Veilira studied him carefully. There was no pride in his voice. No drama. Just exhaustion buried beneath old scars. How long were you there? She asked. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Long enough to forget what sunlight smelled like. That answer lingered heavily in the room. One of the younger officers slowly looked away. Another lowered his weapon toward the floor without realizing it. Veilira noticed all of it. Respect was spreading through the bridge now. Quietly. Unwanted. Earned. Suddenly the tactical display flashed bright orange. Incoming boarding signatures, an officer shouted. Multiple enemy craft attaching to lower hull sectors. Kaler immediately stepped backward from the center platform. Seal the lower decks. Veolyra turned sharply toward her crew. Deploy security teams now. Then she looked at Ethan. How many? Ethan studied the tactical map for less than 2 seconds. Enough to test the ship. And if they break through? Ethan finally met her eyes directly. Calm gray against burning gold. Then they stop hunting the fleet. A long pause followed. And start hunting me. Outside the viewing ports, enemy boarding craft descended through the frozen debris like black insects crawling across ice. The flagship alarms deepened into lower emergency tones now. Closer. More dangerous. Veolyra slowly realized something she had never experienced before in her entire military career. She trusted the humans standing beside her more than half the officers born into her own empire. And that terrified her more than the enemy fleet ever could. The first boarding alarm sounded from Deck 9. Then Deck 11. Then everywhere at once. Deep warning tones rolled through the Karath flagship, while security doors slammed shut across dozens of corridors. Red emergency lights reflected across the polished black floors like rivers of bloodless fire. On the command bridge, fear was no longer hidden behind military discipline. Crew members spoke faster now. Hands trembled over holographic controls. Even seasoned officers avoided looking directly at the tactical display where enemy boarding signals multiplied every second. Veolyra stood at the center platform with her silver war cloak hanging heavily behind her shoulders as new damage reports flooded the chamber. 3 lower defense sectors breached, the tactical commander reported. Security teams are falling back toward the reactor corridors. Prince Kaler cursed under his breath. How did they penetrate the hull this quickly? Ethan answered before anyone else could. Because they were never trying to destroy the ship. His gray eyes remained fixed on the tactical projection. Only isolated. Veolyra turned sharply toward him. You knew this would happen. I expected it. And you said nothing? Ethan finally looked at her. You would not have believed me. The silence after that answer felt heavier than the alarms. Veolyra hated that he was right. Another violent tremor rolled through the flagship. Lights flickered. Somewhere deeper in the vessel, metal groaned beneath pressure. Then the command deck doors burst open and a wounded officer stumbled inside, covered in frost from the lower corridors. Warlord, he breathed heavily. The attackers are bypassing armed stations completely. Veolyra frowned. What? They are ignoring everyone except. His eyes drifted toward Ethan. Him. The entire chamber went still again. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, like a man hearing confirmation of an old nightmare. Veolyra stepped closer to the injured officer. Explain clearly. The enemy troops keep asking for the human champion. They are not taking prisoners. They are searching deck by deck. Prince Kaler slowly backed away from Ethan again. The movement was subtle, instinctive. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. Veolyra studied him carefully now. Who are these people? Ethan remained silent for several seconds while distant impacts echoed through the ship. Finally he answered. Collectors. Collectors of what? His jaw tightened slightly. Survivors. The room chilled around those words. Veolyra suddenly understood the true horror of the arena. It was not entertainment. It was harvesting. Taking the strongest creatures from violent worlds and forcing them into endless cycles of survival until they became something useful. Something feared. Ethan quietly removed one black glove and flexed his scarred hand once before speaking again. If they recapture me, he paused briefly. They will not stop with me. Veolyra's golden eyes narrowed. Meaning, the arena profits from adaptation. His voice remained calm, but exhaustion lived beneath every word now. Once they discover a species survives well under pressure. He looked toward the frightened crew members around the bridge. They start collecting more. The servant boy near the rear console looked horrified. Several officers looked away completely. Veolyra slowly realized that Ethan had never truly been protecting himself aboard this ship. He had been protecting everyone around him from becoming targets. Suddenly the bridge lights dimmed again as emergency power shifted throughout the vessel. The tactical display flashed bright red. Boarding signatures approaching the command deck, someone shouted. Panic spread instantly across the chamber. Officers reached for weapons. Crew members rushed toward emergency exits. Prince Kaler looked ready to flee entirely. Ethan remained perfectly still beside the throne platform. Then, quietly, he reached toward the black collar around his neck for the first time since Veolyra had met him. His fingers brushed the damaged metal carefully. Almost reluctantly, Valera stared at him. "What are you doing?" Ethan looked toward the sealed bridge doors where heavy impacts now echoed from the opposite side. Slow, rhythmic, getting closer. "Making sure," he said softly. "They only came for one monster." The impacts against the command deck doors became louder. Slower now. Controlled. Like whoever stood on the other side already knew they would get in eventually. The bridge crew backed away from the entrance instinctively, while emergency lights painted the chamber in deep red shadows. Frost spread across the metal floor near the sealed doors as outer hull temperatures continued dropping. Somewhere in the distance, the flagship groaned like a wounded animal drifting through ice. Valera stood frozen beside the throne platform, watching Ethan's hand rest against the black collar around his throat. For the first time since meeting him, she saw hesitation in his eyes. Not fear. Something heavier. Memory. "Do not open that collar," she ordered immediately. Ethan looked toward the doors without turning his head. "If they breach this deck while it stays active, they will keep hunting the ship. Then we keep fighting." His expression darkened slightly. "You do not understand what they trained me for." Another impact thundered through the chamber. Several crew members flinched. A crack appeared along the reinforced command doors. Prince Kaler stumbled backward another step. "There must be escape shuttles," he muttered nervously. "We can abandon the vessel." Valera's gaze sharpened instantly. "You would flee your own soldiers?" Kaler avoided her eyes completely. Ethan noticed that too. "He already has," the human said quietly. The prince looked humiliated, but said nothing. Valera turned back toward Ethan. "What happens if that collar comes off?" The bridge fell completely silent, waiting for his answer. Ethan stared at the floor for a long moment before speaking. "The arena conditioned us." His voice sounded distant now. "Hollow. Pain response suppression. Combat adaptation. Adrenaline acceleration." He paused briefly. "They turned survival into instinct." Valera felt cold despite the heat of the failing ship systems. "And you fear becoming that again?" Ethan finally looked at her directly. "No," a long silence followed. "I fear how easy it was." Another deafening impact shook the bridge. The command doors buckled inward this time. Emergency sparks rained from the ceiling. Several officers raised weapons toward the entrance with trembling hands. Ethan stepped forward slowly. Calmly. The red warning lights reflected across the scars on his face, while distant alarms echoed through the dying flagship. "How many security teams remain?" he asked. "Very few," the tactical commander admitted. Ethan nodded once, like a man confirming weather conditions before walking into a storm. Valera suddenly moved in front of him. "No," the single word surprised the entire bridge. Ethan blinked once. "Warlord, you are not fighting this alone." For the first time since she had known him, Ethan looked genuinely caught off guard. Valera stepped closer until only inches separated them. Her golden eyes locked onto the damaged collar around his throat. "The arena may call you property," she said quietly. "But aboard this ship," she paused, "you are under my protection." The room went completely silent. Even Prince Kaler stared in disbelief. Ethan looked at her for several long seconds without speaking. Then something almost invisible shifted in his expression. Not weakness. Not relief. Recognition. Like someone remembering what dignity sounded like after years without hearing it. Suddenly, the command doors exploded inward beneath a final crushing impact. Smoke and freezing air flooded into the bridge corridors beyond. Dark armored figures emerged slowly through the haze, carrying weapons marked with the insignia of the Deathworld arena. The lead figure stepped forward and lowered its hood. Mechanical eyes glowed pale blue beneath scarred gray skin. "Subject Graves," the collector said calmly. "Return voluntarily, and the crew survives." Every officer on the bridge froze. Valera did not move. Neither did Ethan. Then the human slowly reached toward the black collar around his neck again. This time, Valera grabbed his wrist before he could unlock it. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "If you walk out there alone," Ethan met her eyes. "They stop hunting all of you." Valera tightened her grip. "And who protects you?" For the first time in the entire warship, the human had no answer. The frozen air pouring through the shattered command doors carried the smell of metal, engine smoke, and distant snowstorms from the breached lower decks. Red emergency lights flashed across the armored collectors standing inside the smoke-filled corridor, while the Karath bridge remained completely silent. No one moved. No one even breathed loudly anymore. The lead collector stared directly at Ethan with mechanical blue eyes that reflected years of cold obedience. Subject Graves. The machine-like voice repeated. Return voluntarily. Ethan slowly stepped forward. Valira's hand still gripped his wrist tightly. Warm against cold metal. Human skin against alien armor. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan looked down at her hand, almost like he had forgotten what it felt like for someone to stop him from walking toward danger. If I stay, he said quietly, they will tear this ship apart. Valira lifted her chin. Then they attacked the Karath Empire itself. The collector tilted its head slightly. The arena recognizes no empire. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Exhaustion passed across his face like an old shadow returning home. That part is true, he admitted softly. Outside the viewing ports, the frozen battlefield burned with silent flashes as enemy ships continued surrounding the crippled flagship. Ice fragments drifted slowly past the damaged hull, like snow falling underwater. The war no longer mattered now. Only choices. Ethan carefully removed Valira's hand from his wrist, though he did it gently enough that the motion almost felt apologetic. Then, without another word, he reached toward the damaged collar around his throat. The bridge crew watched in complete silence as his fingers pressed against the fractured locking mechanism. A soft metallic click echoed through the chamber. The collar fell into his hand. No alarms sounded afterward. No explosion of violence followed. Somehow that made the moment even more terrifying. Ethan stared at the collar for several long seconds before lowering it slowly onto the black floor beside the throne. The metal hit softly, like chains finally becoming too tired to hold on. Valira watched him carefully. Something about him looked different already. Not more dangerous, just heavier. Like a man carrying an entire world he no longer had the strength to drag behind him. The collectors straightened immediately when the collar came off. Respect, fear, recognition. One of the younger officers near the navigation station whispered under his breath, "Stars protect us." Ethan stepped toward the shattered doorway. Calm, silent, controlled. The same way he had walked through every corridor aboard the flagship since the beginning. But before he crossed the threshold, Valira spoke again. Ethan. He stopped. Her voice softened for the first time since anyone aboard the ship had known her. You asked earlier who protects you. Ethan slowly turned back toward her. Red emergency lights reflected across her deep blue skin and silver armor while the dying ship trembled around them both. Valira stepped down from the throne platform until she stood directly in front of him. Then, in complete silence before her officers, her soldiers, and the enemy waiting beyond the doors, the alien warlord knelt. Gasps spread quietly through the bridge. Prince Kaler looked horrified. No Karath ruler bowed to anyone, especially not a human. Valira lowered her head anyway. You are not arena property, she said softly. You are under my protection now. Ethan stared at her without speaking. The collectors did not move. The officers did not move. Even the ship itself seemed quieter somehow. Then, slowly, Ethan looked away from the shattered corridor behind him and back toward the warlord kneeling at his feet. For the first time in years, the exhaustion in his eyes eased slightly. Not because the danger had disappeared, but because someone finally looked at him and saw a man instead of a weapon. Outside the frozen viewing ports, distant stars reflected softly across the ice fields of Sector 12. And for the first time since surviving the arena, Ethan Graves no longer looked alone.